Hello and welcome to my last video. At least I think it is. So the end is near. So let's go back to the beginning. Now, I say that and let me give you a bunch of caveats on this, hopefully, last video of the course. First of all, you're going to notice that the PowerPoint, the slideshow, is more wordy than normally mine have been. That's because a lot of this, I think, requires more explanation, and I think it would be a good idea to have it where you can, if you want to, pause the video and look at the how it's spelled out. Now, this is largely based on my text-based lecture notes. I have added little stuff to it, so again, word of warning. Another word of warning is this is more the history of economic thought. And I know that's not necessarily going to be exciting for most of you. Now, for this economist nerd that I am, it's very interesting to me, but I realize it won't be for a lot of you. However, this is the thing. A lot of what politicians are thinking and saying and doing today, when it comes to the economy, it's all about these people that we're going to talk about and these schools of economic thought. So it very much applies to our current environment, and it will help you better understand where these politicians are coming from and help you better frame your own independent perspective on what's going on. So without further ado, let's go way back to the classical perspective. And when I say classical, certainly we could go as far back as the Greeks. We could go even further back. So there's always been thoughts about commerce, if you will, or markets. But where it really was refined and clearly spelled out goes back to a guy named Adam Smith. And he's really credited with being the father of modern economics. And he synthesized that economic thought. And he was very much, by the way, a free market advocate. He wrote a book called The Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. So if you think about the title, he was saying, and by the way, as an aside, yes, I know some of this I've already covered, but this is just kind of reiterating and reminding ourselves about this. So the nature and causes of the wealth of nations, yeah, what does that really mean? Well, why are some countries rich? Why are some poor? And we could apply that at the individual level. Why are some people wealthy and why are some poor? Now, obviously, there's myriad of reasons, but fundamentally, overall, there are some basic ideas that he came up with about the wealth of nations and, by extension, individuals. Another guy that was very important and really looked at a lot of Smith's work and refined it was a guy named David Ricardo. He actually at one in his early career was a stockbroker in London, England, and he did so well that he was able to retire at a fairly young age and contemplate economics. And he really did a lot of refining on Smith's work, and then he added to it. For example, Ricardo's the guy that came up with the idea of comparative advantage. Alfred Marshall is another very, very important classical, or we'd even say neoclassical. That term will come up just a little bit. Guy, he really looked at economic analysis and tried to refine it more mathematically. And so he's the guy you can either blame or credit with all the supply and demand graphs. He also developed many other important concepts, including the concept of elasticity that's covered in microeconomics. Now, I know I've told you this in previous videos, but the reason I'm looking it up is because in the environment I'm doing these videos on during this time period, my monitor's way up high, so I have to look up to see where I am. Karl Marx certainly was out of the classical persuasion. He read a lot of Smith's work and analyzed it, but he came up with almost diametrically opposite results from Smith's analysis. So Marx was definitely not pro free market capitalism. He saw a lot of what he thought were ills in the free market capitalistic society, and he also incorporated the German historic view. He was from what we now call Germany. And so he certainly was classical, but he was definitely not pro free market capitalism. So the people of the Smiths tradition, Ricardo and Marshall, those people that follow those individuals more closely, they pretty much dominated economic thought in Western European countries and definitely the United States in the 1800s and up until the Great Depression in the 1900s. Marx, as we know, his thought led to what is called communism, although really it's more of a version of socialism. But so that thought was dominating in some countries in Eastern European countries and some of the Asian countries, and still it exists today in some countries, for example, like North Korea. So in the 1930s, along came John Maynard Keynes. Again, we've talked about him before, but he wrote a book called The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, and it turned classical analysis upside down. Not in the way Marx did, a little different perspective, but it certainly turned the world upside down in terms of economic thought. So one thing is that he concentrated on the short run or the long run. The classicals really looked at things in the long run. I mean, after all, we're talking about 1700s, 1800s. They didn't have computers. They didn't have ways of actually collecting good hard economic data. So about all they could do is look at trends over time. So it makes sense just in terms of ability to have the data to know what's going on in the shorter run. So classicals also focus more on supply and not demand because of something called Say's law. In a nutshell, Say's law is the idea that supply creates its own demand. In other words, if we produce, we build a better mousetrap, is an old saying. We build a new product that's better, and we are able to market so people see that that is a good product. That's something they just have to have. They're going to buy it. Now let's backtrack just a little. How are they going to be able to afford to buy it? Well, in the aggregate, in other words, as we know, aggregate means the entire economy, that production and sales of the new, better mousetrap generates income. And so there's always enough income to purchase what is produced by definition. Remember, from GDP, production and income are the same thing. I apologize for my phone making a noise there. So remember that. So really the focus was on how do we actually grow the economy to expand, have a bigger pie, if you will, as we talked about before, so that with a growing population, those slices don't shrink. On the other hand, Keynes said, really, in the short run, it's demand that drives supply. If businesses aren't selling what they're producing and offering for sale, they're going to cut back, which reduces income and the economy goes down the tank. So that's Say's law in reverse. Sometimes that's called Keynes' law. And Keynes also focused away from the long run to the short run. As a matter of fact, he had a famous quote about the long run. He said, in the long run, we're all dead. So that was his retort to when classicals talked about the long run. Well, it was truly a Keynesian revolution in the 1930s. And by the 1940s, and especially after World War II, um, the dominant economic thought about the overall economy was Keynesian. As a matter of fact, Keynes is known as the father of macroeconomics. Prior to Keynes, there really was no macroeconomics and microeconomics. It was just economics. And so he really is the developer of looking at the aggregates rather than looking at individual markets and then perhaps adding things up to try to get at somewhat overall level. After people had started converting, and by converting I mean they believe the Keynesian approach was the best for looking at the overall economy. They started also doing economic research just to analyze what parts of it were correct and what parts needed to be modified. In addition, some of the classical ideas certainly were not thrown out, and so pro Keynesian economist that also had a classical background kind of synthesized the two together, and so that's often called the neoclassical synthesis. So it's a more general theory that's incorporating both short run and long run demand, and also includes the idea of long run economic growth, which would be the classical side. Now, again, that was the dominant school of thought, at least in Western European countries and definitely in the United States. And to show you how far I go back, that was macroeconomic the macroeconomic model that I studied early on in undergraduate school. It was just Keynesian. That was it. But then you started having some people that had more classical roots and saw some issues with Keynesian analysis and started focusing on money and looking at the Fed and how maybe it impacted the overall economy, not in a necessarily a positive way. And so Milton Friedman is really the father of what we call monetarists. So from the name, you can probably see that they actually focus more on money and how the central bank can actually have a negative effect on the economy by the monetary policy that they advocate. What they ended up analyzing was the Fed is more destabilizing than stabilizing, and so the Fed should really follow a consistent rule and not worry about those short run variations in the economy. Now, in the 1970s and 80s, you started having people, again, looking back at the classical analysis and saying, you know what, there's no consistency between microeconomics and macroeconomics. Here we still have micro. One of our basic assumptions in macroeconomics is that individuals are that individuals are rational, and then we throw that totally out at the macro level. And so there was a movement to provide micro foundations for macroeconomics. And so these economists incorporated the idea of rational economic thought, and they became known as those that adopted the rational expectations hypothesis. And you can really boil that down to the old saying, you can fool some of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time. And so what it's saying is that people are not going to just be fooled, and that's the only way Keynesian analysis works. If they are fooled into doing things that later turn out to be not what would be beneficial for them and the economy. And so Keynesian analysis really relies on a view not of rational expectations, but what we call adaptive expectations, and that's really just backward looking. So they argue that's not the way people actually look. Now, that's not to say people, are perfectly capable of estimating what they think the future is going to be. Obviously, the future is unknown and uncertain, but statistically, mathematically, so this perspective is very statistically oriented, very mathematically oriented. Statistically, some people maybe underestimate what's going to happen in the future. Others overestimate, but if you look at how that averages out, the actual estimation will be pretty close to what happens. So that's the rational expectations perspective.